In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips to improve your orchestra's sight reading by improving their rudiments. I know that it's probably obvious that having good rudiments or understanding all the little patterns within music will lead to success in the sight reading room. I don't think anybody's going to be terribly shocked about this, but in this video, I'm going to give you some tips that I use in my classroom to improve the rudiments. If you're a more experienced teacher, let's see how many of these tips you use already in your classroom. So let's get started with tip number 1, understanding the key signature. Do your students understand how to read a key signature? Do they know that the key signature changes their finger patterns? Do they know the difference between F sharp and F natural in their concert music? In their concert music, they can learn all the finger patterns by getting consistent yet gentle reminders to play the correct pitches. But in the sight reading room, time is limited. Of course, you're going to reinforce that.
Of course!
Reteach and redirect your students to the correct key and finger patterns. But I don't want you to forget about other things like rhythm, dynamics, and phrasing. Wouldn't it be cool if this was somewhat automatic? There's an exercise that I like to do with my students that I call Skittles, which basically runs through all the finger patterns on all 5 strings quickly. You probably have some sort of variation like that you use, but I plan on making a video about how I teach this in an upcoming video. So be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell or whatever so that you can see it when it comes out. If you do full orchestra, key signature becomes maybe the most important thing that you do to prepare your group for sight reading. Because your woodwinds, brass, and possibly mallet instruments are going to be reading in keys that you may never get to in the band classes. Even in my high school full orchestra, which is a pretty good group, loaded with lots of all-staters, we sometimes struggle with F sharp in the winds. So that's something I like to address in pretty much every rehearsal because I'm not going to chance it. Tip number 2, understanding rhythm. There are a ton of ways to teach rhythm, and I'm fortunate enough to have technology in my classroom to help me. If you don't worry. There are some apps and things that they can do at home instead. But the first thing that I really like to use is something called Rhythm Bee, and it's probably my favorite one out there. It does cost a little bit of money. It's $175 per year for a subscription fee, but I think it's worth every penny. By the way, Rhythm Bee is not a sponsor of Teaching Orchestra. We actually have no sponsors. But if you're watching this, Dr. Green, maybe we can partner up. Anyhow, Rhythm Bee is probably the Cadillac of instructional tools when it comes to rhythm, but there are some others out there as well. There's Rhythm Trainer, and that's pretty good. There's something called Rhythm Lock, and that's great, but it's only available for iOS. Sorry, Android. And there's something called 4.4.io. And this is a really fun way for your students to learn rhythm and kind of play around with it. There's a sandbox mode where they can kind of make their own beats and have fun. And maybe you could give out some extra credit for making beats at home and starting that path to becoming a DJ. Tip number 3, keeping a steady beat. What are the pitfalls in keeping uniform tempo? Bow placement, bow speed, and bow weight. Where do your students need to play 8th notes? Where do they need to play quarter notes? Where do they need to play half notes? Do they play with uniform bow speed? Metronome work is pretty awesome for some groups, but it really helps to keep your students together in the sight reading room by addressing bow speed, bow placement, bow weight, because in most competitions, they don't let you use a metronome. Tip 4, understanding rests. In the sight reading room, I like to think of rests as landmines. If you play in a rest, it's like clicking that tile in Minesweeper and kaboom. In the sight reading room, it's just not about what you play, it's about what you don't play. And what's more obvious than playing in a rest? Rests are extremely important. Make sure that your students take them very seriously too. Tip number 5, understanding meter. Your duple meter shouldn't be too much of an issue, but heaven help us if we get a sight reading piece in 3/4 time. Why is that a problem? Well, because you often get half notes followed by quarter notes, and that creates asymmetrical bowings. And if you remember back to tip number 3, the whole uniform bow thing, you can see how that might be a problem. Compound time is also really tricky because sometimes you've got quarter note, eighth note patterns, which are also asymmetrical, and plus sometimes students don't have a lot of exposure to meters like 6/8, and they get really disoriented quickly. Finally, a la breve, or that misnomer cut time, and I'll get into that maybe in another video about why I don't use the term cut time ever in my classroom. But basically when the half note gets the beat, things can get confusing and your students can miscount a rhythm, get lost, and that can be a real problem. So I highly recommend that your students get comfortable playing in all sorts of different meters. For instance, here in Texas, under UIL CNSR rules, a 1C orchestra is not going to have the same key signature, meter, or rhythm flexibility as a 6A orchestra. So it might be helpful to know how to prepare for your group so that you take a more targeted approach to sight reading. All right, cool. So how many of these tips are you already using in your classroom? Or are you doing even cooler stuff that I didn't mention? Please consider dropping a comment in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.